Okay, so now we're going to have a look at who are the Arabs. When was the first mention of Arabs in history, what the ancients knew of the Arabs, and what the Arabs knew of themselves, and who the ancestors of Rasulullah were. Now, as I mentioned, I'm going to scan through historical documents from the Romans, the Greeks, the Egyptians, possibly the Persians and the Assyrians in mentioning who the Arabs are. And it's going to be lengthy, and I'm going to indulge myself first and foremost in this, is because I have an interest in that area and the prehistory of the area. So I'm going to give a lot of references to what these nations knew of the Arabs, as opposed to just kind of like washing over the prehistory quickly and then moving on to the Seerah of Rasulullah. So apologies if you do get bored, but this was something that I had to do. Okay, so first we look at what's known as the land of Arabia. What was considered the land of Arabia in the pre-Islamic period? So in the earlier sources, Arabia has always signified the steppe desert areas and the desert wastes bordering the Egypt and Syria and the Mesopotamia. So Mesopotamia, Iraq and Syria. Southern Syria is desert land. Moving down from there, Jordan, today's Jordan, which is the same Arabian desert, and then into the Arabia proper. And parts of the Negev desert and the Egyptian desert, all of them were considered Arabia by Herodotus. Pliny the Elder also mentions beyond the Pleiadic, easternmost mouth of the Nile is Arabia, extending to the Red Sea. So it's the same area. In the Persian administrative lists from the era of Darius, which was the second king after Cyrus, 521-486, a district called Arabia is mentioned between Assyria and Egypt. Again, it's the same area. This also includes the Syrian desert. This corresponds with Pliny's Arabia of the nomads, lying east of the Red Sea. So this is what the people knew to be the land of the Arabs, because the Arabs came from this land. And there weren't just Arabs living in this area, there were other nations living here also, but the Arabs proper came from this area. And it's significant to know this, because later when we look at where the Arabs came from and where they moved to and the origin of their language, it's very important to know these geographic areas. Herodotus mentions South Arabia also, even though the tribes of South Arabia were not Arabian tribes. Arabia is the most distant to the south of all inhabited countries, and this is the only country which yields frankincense and myrrh. This is what Herodotus says. For Herodotus, it remained a land of mystery. Indeed, it was a land of mystery to everybody at that time, because it was so far away from what their understanding of civilization was, that even when they wanted to invade it, they would, and it was the only reason they wanted to invade it was because of the rich lands in the south, the trade routes, and the frankincense and myrrh that was coming, that they had to go around. They wouldn't really go in the interior because there was nothing there. For example, Greco-Roman writers sporadically called the Nabateans Arabs and their kingdom Arabia, yet these terms occur in none of the approximately 5,000 Nabatean inscriptions. So Nabatea, when we have a look at the northern kingdoms and the southern kingdoms of the Arabs, we'll see that the Romans and the Greeks had their own ideas of what constituted an Arab, but it may not necessarily have been what those people called themselves. Now, certainly today we do think that the Nabateans are Arabs, but it's interesting in that in their own inscriptions, they've never really discussed that. They don't call themselves Arabs in their own inscriptions. And there are possible reasons for this, which we'll look at, but it's enough to know now that this is what the Romans thought of them. Like, for example, there's a Nabatean text, the text from Jabal Judayhid in northwest Arabia reads, "May Musk the Nabatean be granted security in the presence of the goddess Manat." So again, we can see this name Manat is a name that's familiar to the Arabs. It's a goddess that's mentioned in the Quran also. It was a Nabatean goddess, but again, he never referred to himself as an Arab. That comes much, much later in Arabian literature, and at that early date, they didn't refer to themselves as Arabs. Palmyra, which is a city which we consider to be an Arabian city, is a curious mix. It was probably a mix of Arabians, Arameans, Greeks, and other such people, Ammonites and whoever. They never mentioned themselves as Arabs, and neither did the Greeks and Romans, who heavily dealt with them and at various points even conquered them, didn't call them Arabs. So problems with identity in antiquity. Before the 2nd century AD, Arabs, as we mentioned, applied to people Eastern Egypt and the Delta area, Sinai, southern Palestine, Samaria, northern Transjordan, southern Transjordan, the southern parts of the Lebanon, the Bekaa Valley and the Anti-Lebanon and Mount Hermon, northern, central and southern Syria, the Jazeera, which is the peninsula, northern, central, southern Mesopotamia and western Iran. So straight away you can see problems with this. Even areas that were not Arab were sometimes identified as Arab. So naturally the people who would identify these areas as Arab would put tribes that do not belong as Arab tribes into that area, right? So Mesopotamia, northern, central and southern Mesopotamia, they were never Arab, right? The fringes of the Arabian desert that hit Mesopotamia, yes, they were Arab tribes there, but these areas, they were not Arabs. So for example, people like the Assyrians, the Assyrian Christians inside of Iraq today, the Manideans, the Yazidis, some of these people are not Arabs. To this day, they have a separate identity. They don't call themselves Arabs because they are not Arabs. And even Western Iran, parts of Western Iran, right? When the Arabs invaded north towards the southern part, Khuzestan and those parts of Iran, yes, there are Arab tribes there today, but these Arab tribes didn't exist at that point. But they've been lumped together, right, as an Arab area. And Iranians, we know, are not Arabs. Why is this important for us, and why were these demarcations hazy? That's because the actual term Arab is a hazy term. Certainly today it's a hazy term, and we look at it when we get to that part, and in the past it was a hazy term as well. What constitutes an Arab? Who is an Arab? We'll have a look at the sources and then we'll move on to the present time. So the problem is that most definitions of who is Arab come from outsiders who tended to label everybody in the peninsula as Arab, as I just mentioned, right? But not everybody. Even today, Arabs have a misunderstanding and they think that all Yemenis people from the old Sabaean, Katabanic, Hadramic, the Minayans were Arabs, but they never self-identified as Arabs. Their gods were different, their culture was different, their way of life was different, and they never self-identified as Arabs, right? But we have this understanding that just because they're from the Arabian Peninsula, that they're all Arab. They weren't Arab. So by the end of the Hellenistic period, populations from Eastern Egypt throughout the Fertile Crescent and the Arab-Persian Gulf, around the edges of the peninsula and even central Iran, were all labeled as Arab and Saracen. The name Saracen, which we still hold on to today, comes from those times. Saracen and Arab. And these, yes, certainly many areas were Arab, not all these areas were Arab. So after the Roman annexation of the Nabatean kingdom in AD 106, they called it Provincia Arabia. So thereafter, for administrative purposes, anybody who ends up in that province of the Roman Empire is going to be known as an Arab Roman. So you could be of an ethnic group that's not Arab, but you're automatically labeled Arab. And for all intents and purposes, for administrative purposes, you're dealt with as an Arab. And then as later writers come, all the way down to Islamic times, you're labeled an Arab when you really weren't an Arab. You never self-identified as an Arab. And to this day, we don't really know what, at that early date, what the people of the Arabian Peninsula identified themselves as. They were a disparate people. They never had an understanding of solidarity or a nation as such. So they couldn't have identified themselves as Arabs. They may have had a vague understanding that they were Arab. They would most probably identify themselves as by their tribal names and their larger confederations. Some of these were like huge confederations, but certainly not as an Arab at that early date, because such massive geopolitical considerations or identities didn't occur to people that were struggling to survive, right? That they were parts of tribal confederations, vying with each other for grazing rights and raiding each other and just barely trying to survive, and sometimes dealing with the superpowers of the age if you were in the south or in the north, and if you were in the middle you were relatively isolated from everybody else. And this idea of this Arab identity, to link yourself with, you know, the greater Arabs, it didn't exist. The Romans named the southern part of Arabia Felix. Now this was the Yemen, the part of Yemen. So now the Romans named it Arabia Felix, which means happy Arabia or fortunate Arabia, abundant Arabia. But again, it wasn't Arab in any sense of the term. The Yemen at that time, the kingdom of Sheba, Sabaeans, and all of those people there, they didn't self-identify as Arabs, and they weren't Arabs. As mentioned, their gods were different, they spoke different languages, and their culture was different. So when was the earliest mention of the name Arab that we know in recorded history? Well, the first mention of the name Arab comes from somebody who was known as Gindabu. Gindabu, Jundab in present Arabic, which means locust or grasshopper. He was a tribal chief that was caught up in a war with the Assyrian Empire, and he's mentioned in a monolith inscription, which we'll have a look at. So it was from the 9th century BCE that the earliest mention was. It's a name on a list of kings of Syria in a monolith inscription from Kirkuk of Assyrian. It's an Assyrian monolith, King Shalmaneser III. So this is 856 BCE, so it's almost 3,000 years ago, describing the Battle of Qarqar in 853. And now this is a very important document that we have for more than one reason. We'll have a look at it. This monolith was discovered in 1861 by British archaeologist George Taylor, who was the British Consul General stationed in the Ottoman Elayat of Kurdistan in a town called Kurk. So this document, it was a stele, it was a stone monolith, and it had documented this particular name here. It was a war that Shalmaneser had with various tribes from Syria. It was a league of tribes that he went and conquered, and they banded together to fight him off. And the first name, Ariba, is mentioned here. So there are two stele here, Ashur Nasirpal II and his son Shalmaneser III. Now the Shalmaneser monolith contains a description of the Battle of Qarqar. So here is the monolith here now. So this is the monolith, and you can see the cuneiform writing here, and this is where that name was mentioned. Here it is again. That's him here, Shalmaneser. These are the two monoliths, and this is a tracing of it. So Tel Qarqar, that's the mound of Qarqar, is located in the Hama governorate of Syria. It has a continuous history of 10,000 years of occupation. You'll see a lot of those cities in that area they've been occupied for that long. And it has two mounds. It was unfortunately destroyed in 2014 and 17 by the Turkestan Islamic Party. These are terrorist organizations that went into Syria in the wake of the Syrian civil war, and unfortunately you'll find that many of these organizations and ISIS, Daesh, by far the one that did the most damage, they have damaged and looted many of these sites in Iraq and in Syria. And it's a shame really, because these treasures have been there for us to learn by for thousands of years, and these groups come along, these ignorant groups, and destroy world heritage. So the Battle of Qarqar was fought in 853 BCE, so that's almost 3,000 years ago, by Shalmaneser with an allied army of 11 kings at Qarqar. So there were 11 kings that allied together to fight against Shalmaneser. Shalmaneser was an imperial. He had an imperial army fighting against smaller kingdoms that had to band together to fight him. This battle is notable for having a large number of combatants than any other previous battle, and the first instance of some people entering recorded history, such as the Arabs, and it was a particular Jewish king they mentioned as well. 12 kings is an Akkadian term meant to symbolize any kind of alliance. It was actually 11 kings, but it's like when we say, 7 seas or like this, or when we round off to 10. So they would round off to 12. It's actually 11 kings, and these are the kings. So there was King Hadadezer himself, commanded 1,000 chariots and 1,000 horsemen, 20,000 soldiers. Now some of these figures, these zeros, you can kind of, just take off the extra zero at the end. They seem like exaggerations. And the list goes through. And here you'd see towards the bottom, King Gindubu of Arabia sent 1,000 camel cavalry. Right. So camels is what the Arabians were famous for, and that was the mode of transport used in the desert. And they say that camels were domesticated 1000 BCE. So it's interesting that he sent a cavalry corps of 1000 cavalry to fight in that war. So here is a map of the battle, and here it was fought. So here he's describing another king, King Yehuda, son of Hazael, king of the Kedarites. So here Ashurbanipal's earliest account of his campaign against the Arabs, 649 BC, and describes how King Yuta, son of Hazael, king of the Kedarites, revolted against Ashurbanipal, together with another king called Amaluddin. So when this revolt was subjugated, he put a puppet king on the throne called Abiyat. Now, the Kedarites are an important tribal confederation. We look at them further, and the genealogy of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, goes back to Kedar, one of the sons of Ismail alayhi salam, going back to Abraham. So whilst we find reference to a nomadic people called Arabs in the Assyrian records, it is still not certain that they were then speaking a language identified as Arabic, since the term Arab is employed in Assyrian inscriptions as a collective name for all nomadic groups living in the north. So even though the Assyrians referred to them as Arabs, did they self-identify as Arab back then? Did they speak the Arabian language? Certainly they didn't speak Arab as we know it today, but did they even speak an Arabian dialect close to the Arab of today, or was it just a Semitic language? We will never know until we find more epigraphic graffito. The inscription of Tiglath-Pileser III, where the word naga, right, which is in Arabic she-camel, is used, occurs with the Arabian definite article al. So what's interesting here is it could be a case of an Arabian name adopted into the language of the Assyrians at that time, because they were related Semitic languages, and we have word borrowings all the time. Or it could be a name that they had. It could be a genuine name that they use for Naka also. But what's interesting is the definite article, which is an Arabic addition, right? Al was used here. An-Naka. In fact, the word Naka continues to be used in Assyrian inscriptions until the time of Sargon, where Babylonian word formation was applied to this word and it became Nakati. Okay, that's an interesting observation there. The camel was most strongly associated with desert dwellers. The inscription is considered to be one of the most important Assyrian inscriptions because it names an Israelite king who is mentioned in the Old Testament. And moreover, this text is the second primary source that mentions Arabs. It mentions Zabiba, who was an Arab queen. Zabiba in the Arabian language today means raisin. In fact, while female rulers were rare in the ancient Near East, Arab priestesses played a significant role in the community. So we have, for example, the story of Abdul Muttalib when he went to see an Arab priestess to decide on how to salvage the life of Rasulullah's father when he wanted to sacrifice him. We have the story of Hind, when Hinda was accused of some kind of slanderous behavior, that she had to herself go to a priestess towards the Yemen who was to absolve her. Right? This was much before Islam. Something had happened, and she was pure of the accusation that was levied against her, and it was clarified by the Qahina, the priestess. And even if we look at the Kedarite queens, they weren't like kings or queens as such. They were religious figures, religious priestesses, Qahinas, soothsayers, people that could inspire followings based on their communication with the other world as they understood it, and that would put them in positions of leadership. And it was interesting that the Kedarite, which was the most highly organized the Arabian confederation of the past, the pre-Islamic Arabia, was run by a woman at one point, a very famous woman, in fact. Her name still comes down to us. So here's a picture now of one of those wars, and you can clearly see, if you look towards the bottom and at the top, you can see the Assyrians at war with the Arabs. And what do the Arabs have? Camels. What differentiates them between other armies is the Arabs have dromedaries, they have camels, they are fighting, and there are 2 on 1 camel. So this also shows the mode of fighting that the Arabs used. 2, one commanding the camel with his spear in the front, and the other one with what looks like a bow and arrow in his hand, firing arrows from behind. And from their dress you can infer they are Arabs, and you can see how they're just wearing the loincloths. Many people, I mean, in war that would be what you would wear anyway, because it leads for ease of movement. Chainmail was a very rare thing back then, only the richest could afford it. Here again is a clearer picture, and you can see there's a dead Arab on the floor, and you can see the Assyrian army. They have their armor on, they have a shield and a spear, whereas the Arabs has what look like either a stick, which they use to fend themselves off with and to control the camel, or it could be a spear, and then the rider on the back has an arrow and is shooting. And it's interesting because he's facing backwards, which means that they had learnt the art of mounted archery. The inscription contained in Tilgath-Piles's third inscription stela mentions another Arab queen. It refers to Shamsi and her denunciation of the covenant with Assyria. So this is the text now. As for Shamsi, queen of the land of Arabia, here is the name again. He's mentioned it as the Mat Arabi here in their language, land of Arabia, at Mount Sakari, her camp, and she took fright. So I've posted the text here, but I'm not going to read it because there are gaps and it's a bit difficult to read. But he mentions here the tribute brought forward, such as camels and silver. And he brought the coalition of the defeated rulers into his court and got them to kiss his feet. Shamsi and a tribute to Syria mentioned in another Assyrian inscription also. So she was another Arabian queen. This inscription mentions the Sabaeans in the north, which is interesting, as it is earlier than commonly assumed. Now the Sabaeans were South Arabian, a nation. We know it as the Sheba, the Queen of Sheba story. Now the Sabaeans mentioned here is interesting. One of the possible reasons why they mention here so far north is that they were traders, and they could have been trading up north and got stuck into this mess. The tribute was heavy and many Arab warriors were killed. Moreover, Tiglath-Pileser III appointed an officer as a political agent to supervise Shamsi and her people. So the Arabs lost, and of course they were bound to lose because the Assyrians were an imperial power for a long time, and it's not easy for a ragtag bunch of warriors on camelback to face an imperial army. As for Shamsi, queen of the Arabs at Mount, this is a text again. As for Shamsi, queen of the Arabs at Mount Saruki, defeated 9,400 of her people. I took away from her 1,000 people, 30,000 camels, 20,000 ox, 5,000 pouches of all types of aromatics, thrones of her gods, the military equipment and staffs of her goddesses, and her property. Moreover, she, in order to save her life, like a female onega I set the rest of her possessions and her people safeguard within her camp on fire. Shamsi became startled by my mighty weapons, and she brought camels and she-camels which are very valuable with her young to Syria before me. I placed a representative of mine over her and 10,000 soldiers. Neo-Syrian royal inscription. So this isn't a royal inscription. So a heavy tax was a heavy punishment was imposed on them, and one of the reasons for these punishments is that it drains their coffers, it drains their treasury. So it's not very easy for them to then mount another war against an imperial army, and it weakens them also because queens and kings in tribal settings are normally in positions of power based on the favors that they bestow upon those below them. So if you've taken away their sources of their wealth, it weakens them, and then it foments civil war, and it keeps you weak, and then it's not so easy for you to face an imperial army again in the future. So also the word queen is used here. So it's interesting to know Because again, to know who Arabs are and not Arabs are, we need to know what they call themselves and what their rulers call themselves. Because we know that the South Arabians, when I say South Arabians, we're not talking about Arabian tribes, we're talking about South Arabia as an entity and then North Arabian entities. So the South Arabians, the kingdoms, they refer to themselves as Mukarrib and as Tubba, which had different meanings and implications for what they understood as kingship. Like, for example, the Egyptians and then the Assyrians and the Akkadians, and the Romans and the Greeks, their ideas of kingship were different than what the Arabs understood kingship to mean. So we can infer from what they understood who was Arab and who was an Arab. So Shamsi is called a queen here. What does a queen mean? Like we mentioned that she was like a priestess, like a kahina, like a soothsayer, like a priestess, somebody who communicated with the other world. Those kind of people were leaders for the Arabs, especially from the Khidrite confederate. The term is used in the Sumerian inscriptions was Lugal. Lugal consists of two syllables, Lu, man, and Gal, king. So this is what the Syrians assigned to the Arabs, because they had a king themselves, and the king was a representative of God. God had put the king, it was like ruled by divine right. So in the ancient world, kings had a very important station. They had to be obeyed. They were either appointed by God, as in the Assyrian, Akkadian kingdoms, or they were gods, as in the Egyptians. So if you look at the inscriptions from the Assyrian Empire and the Akkadians, you'll see the king going to fight, standing side by side with his warriors. Whereas if you look at the Egyptians, because the Egyptian king was God, so you'll see him dominating the hieroglyphics and single-handedly fending off the whole army, because that was the job of a god, right? So what did the Arabs call themselves? Now in Akkadian texts we find the term milku, meaning prince or king, right? In later Arabic that would be malik, or intelligent man, or the man advised by the deity. Malkatu would be the feminine, the ta marabuta at the end, the feminine marker. Ta marabuta, I say this because of the Arabic. Back then it would be a feminine marker, but would it be called this? So here is the idea that kingship is bestowed by a deity. This is an idea that is seen in all civilized areas, right? Kingship as given to you by a deity. Certainly if they didn't believe that themselves, it was a way of legitimizing their claim. So when somebody comes up and takes the throne, it may be usurped, it may not be usurped. He has to have legitimacy to rule, right? Like in China, it was the mandate of heaven, all under heaven. So for the Assyrians, an imperial empire, a civilized empire, to take the reins of power, you had to be divinely appointed, where people would then follow you. But the Arabs didn't have that understanding at that time. So, for example, we have in the Hebrew writings, the term Malik signified the ruler or person who had authority from God to rule his people. Again, the Hebrew areas were more civilized than the Arabian areas at that time. The equivalent term in Arabic is Malik, signifying a person who has authority or one who rules a nation, tribe, or territory. Now, that doesn't mean necessarily by divine right, because divine right has the idea of a civilizational understanding of the divine right of kings. That concept didn't exist with the Arabs. So we have the cognate mulk, dominion, mulk. So a malik has a mulk, a dominion. In addition, the Assyrian inscriptions mention foreign leaders as kings, saru. So they would call them saru. So just because they would call people saru and then the Arab leaders became known as kings, it didn't mean that they saw themselves as kings. So for example, Hazail, king of Arabia, the splendor of my majesty. Hazailu Sar Arabi. Sar means king of the Arabs. Sar Arabi here, of the Khidrites. Now, going into the southern Arabian kingdoms, who were also civilized kingdoms, we look at what they would know themselves as. So during the first stage, from 800 to 650 BCE, their leaders were called Mukarrib. Now, Muqarrib is like a unifier, it's like a high priest, it's like somebody who unifies. So again, it's the unification of the people. He is the central rallying point, and he is the connection between God and himself. Right? He is the one who you can contact God through. So this was in the early phase of the Sabaean kingdoms. At that time, all religious duties and everything was done through them. Like even today, like the king, for example, here, the King of England is also the head of the Church of England, and the Khalifa has to inaugurate, who's representative, who is like appointed, right? The Khalifa is a representation of Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, who is appointed by Allah Subhanahu wa Taala. So he is the one that inaugurates. He is the one that leads the Jum'ah prayer on Yawm al-Jumu'ah, and many things are not done until the king arrives. So this is across the board in all civilizations. The Muqarrib, he was the connection. He was the one that during the important festivals and everything would open the festival, so to speak, by performing the first ritual, the pagan rites. So during the second stage of the Sabaean history from 650 to 115 BCE, the rulers were called Malik. Semitic language, not the Arabian language. It was a Semitic language related to Old Arabic. It was a related language, so you're going to get the word Malik. How it was pronounced, we don't know for sure, because we don't have vowel signs in any of the old the writings. It's just consonants. So anybody's guess is as good as anybody else's. And they transferred the capital city from Sarawak to Ma'arib. The first ruler to style himself Malik instead of Muqarrib was Karib il-Watar. He's mentioned in Islamic sources as well. It's interesting that this was the first time, because now they had grown, they had evolved as a civilization. So then they understood Malik. Okay, so it's not primitive Muqarrib, now it's a king. During the third stage, from 115 BCE to 300 CE, Common Era, the rulers were called kings of Saba and Duraydan. Saba was the principal and the most prestigious kingdom there, so it was prestigious to call yourselves, like king of both Raydan and of Saba. So it's like when the Akkadians would call themselves kings of Sumer and Akkad, right? Prestige, because of the great Sumerian empire that was there before them. So they're firmly called kings now at a much later date. So during the fourth stage, from 300 to 500 CE, the Sabaean rulers were called kings of Saba and Duraydan and Hadramaut and Yemenite and Arabiha in Al-Murtafa'at and in At-Tihama, and this stage terminated with Assyrian and Persian invasions. They had expanded this title of kingship to cover many other areas as well. By this time they were a very powerful entity. So in fact the term Malik, king, was in common use in all levels of Arab societies, small and large. In addition, the term king was used in South Arabia to describe leaders of small nomadic groups, even if those groups did not have their own defined territory. For example, Kamenahu and Haram, which were small groups of people living in an area of less than 100 square kilometers in Wadi Mudhab in the north of Timam, called their leaders king. So for Arabs across the board, whether they were priestesses, whether they were whatever they were, they styled themselves as kings. So if we hold on to the title king and then we differentiate that from Tubba, Muqarrib, Muqayqis, like the Egyptian rulers were called in the latter period when the Romans were there, were called Muqayqis, right? And from that we have Caesar, and then we have Tsar, like in Russia, we have Qaisar, we have Kaiser, the Kaiser in Rome. This is the same ancient title being carried forth. The Persian rulers were called the Kai, Kisra in Arabic, Khusru, Kai Khusru. Those tribes that immigrated to the Indian subcontinent became Kiyani, and then Ghakkar later on. So you can see the evolution of this name. Before that in Egypt it was the pharaohs, right? So the pharaonic house was there. And then before, in the time of Ibrahim alayhi salam and Yusuf alayhi salam, the Hyksos, however you pronounce that name, they weren't pharaohs. It was another royal house, and they didn't call themselves pharaohs. The pharaonic royal house was a different house, different title. So anybody called like the Tubba, like the latter part of the Yemeni rulers from Aksum and Himyar labeled themselves Tubba. Tubba, it was a title. So king, the title king would refer to Arabs, and it didn't necessarily mean kings in the way that we understand kings today. A tribal chief, king. Right? The Romans and the Persians respectively crowned the heads of the tribal chiefs of Ghassan and the Bani Lahm, the Nasrids and the Jafanids as kings of Al-Hira, kings of the way the Ghassanids lived. So even when Abraha and the Himyarites seized the Sabaeans' territory, they defined themselves as kings of Saba, because Saba was more prestigious than Aksum, even though Aksum was the imperial power with Roman backing invading Yemen at that time. They called themselves, they styled themselves kings of Saba because of the prestige that Saba had for a millennia before that time. So at a very early stage in South Arabian history, kings had an absolute authority in legislation until later laws were made by parliament. So it's natural over a while you get an evolution, so the power of the absolute ruler is tempered by some sort of a parliament where they decide collectively on certain issues, because they understand that giving too much power into one hand sometimes can be dangerous. But it was totally different with the Egyptians, where it was an absolute kind of a godhead that was manifested in the form of the pharaoh. Now these ideas don't hold true for nomadic people. The idea of kingship, the idea of a tribal chief that had ultimate power didn't really exist with nomadic people, because there were so many variables of self-survival in place that the tribal chief, the priest, priestess, or the one who's taking the reins of power couldn't arrogate ultimate power to himself. So that's the reason why you see in tribal settings, the chief would sit with you, eat with you, even consult with you, and then they would plan together when they would decide to invade. It wasn't the absolute word of the chief that we're going to invade and everything. So it's important to understand these differences in understanding who Arabs were and what differentiated Arabs from all the people around them at that time. So moving back onto Tiglath-Pilesar's dealing with the Arabs. So according to his stele, which was discovered in the palace at Kala, the king received tribute from the Arab queen Zabiba, and he says, I received the tribute of Kastapsi, Kamuhite, and it's a big list again. You could read this for yourself. He's talking about how he dealt with them. And now we're going on to who called themselves the Arabs. So the Arabs didn't frequently identify themselves as Arabs from Shalmaneser to the advent of Islam. One of the reasons is pretty straightforward to understand. If you're living, say for example, that you are of Japanese heritage, inside of Japan during the feudal era, would you identify yourself as Japanese inside of Japan? Or would you identify yourself as the shogun you belong to, right? Your affiliation with a particular warlord or a tribal group. And that's what we find in the Arabian Peninsula. People who write about themselves write about their tribe, they mention their gods, they mention their tribes, they mention their name and their forefathers' names. But they're not going to say Arab, because why would an Arab identify himself on graffiti inside the Arabian Peninsula as Arab? It only makes sense when you're abroad. So when you visit, like for trade, when you visit the Greek lands or Egypt, then it's possible you may find something identifying as Arab. But within the peninsula, you do not find. But even though that's a possible reason, that still doesn't conclusively answer the question, is that did the Arabs know themselves as Arabs? They may not have known themselves as Arabs, right? The identity, the collective identity of Arabs probably came much later. So the idea that prior to Alexander's conquest of Egypt, there was a tendency among both the Greeks and the Egyptians, and indeed in the Near East in general, to label as Arabs any groups of people that exhibited nomadic characteristics. Now, today we know that there are two types of Arabs. Even from a hadith, we know that there are the Hadara, right? And then there are the Badu, the Badu are the nomadic Arabs, and then the Hadara are the civilized Arabs. There's always been this demarcation in Arabia of the civilized, the Arabs who live in the cities as opposed to the Arabs who live in the desert. But this collective identity was put upon everybody in the Arabian Peninsula, regardless of whether they were Arab tribes or not. Another interesting point is in that region we had a lot of female queens for that particular time. So we had like the Queen of Sheba, Queen Hatshepsut, Queen Zabiba. There was Deborah and Yael in Israel. There was the wife of Sennacherib. Her name was Naqtiya Zaktu. She exercised huge power. There was Ti'el Kuna, the Kedarite queen. She ruled at Admatu. Admatu is the Assyrian name for Dummat al-Jandal, which is known as Duma from the Bible. Duma was one of the sons of Ismail alayhi salam, who was the son of Abraham. Abdul Muttalib went to a Kahina, a woman of great influence. So most of what we know about Arabs themselves comes from tens of thousands of rock inscriptions that litter the Arabian desert, and we will have a whole lecture inshallah on what we know about those inscriptions and how we ended up translating those inscriptions. It's a fascinating subject, and these are in many languages, some of them closely related to Arabic, some of them very far from Arabic, and all of them of the Semitic family of languages. Nabonidus, Nebunaid, as he's known in his original language, the Babylonian language, Aramaic. Nabonidus temporarily relocated himself to the city of Taima for a period of 10 years. We don't know why he did this, but one of the reasons why we think he did this is because it sat astride the trade routes. And Dedan and Taima, two cities mentioned in the Bible also, he moved there for 10 years, and he was only toppled when Cyrus the Great, Khorosh of the Hakamenish, the Archaemenid Empire, toppled his dynasty, and then the Persians came to power. He enlisted, we know from his inscriptions that he enlisted Arabian troops to help him further his cause there. So at that time, here's another reference to Arabs in that area. And it's interesting is that the Romans enlisted Arabian troops around the edges. The Persians enlisted mercenaries when they needed them, and actually Cambyses used the Arabs as an entourage for his army to help him get across to Egypt, and ever since then he had good relations with them. And so the Persians, the Parthians used them as in the Lakhmids, the Romans used them as in the Ghassanids, and all the other empires in between. So everybody who could, they used the Arabs. The Arabs were always known as warriors because they were out on the outskirts of civilized setting. They could easily be recruited to be used in whatever function they were to be used for, as soldiers, as mercenaries, as guards, as guides, and as like pawns in a political game even. So we have Arabs appearing on lists of people under the control of the Achaemenid Persian Empire. Now this is very interesting because at that time the Achaemenid Empire was the largest empire in the world. So it covered more area than the Assyrians and the Akkadians had done, and even what the Romans had did up to that time. And we have a very interesting naqsh. We have a very interesting inscription called Naqsh Rustam in the wall that mentions the Arabs. So this is the Naqsh Rustam of Darius I, Darabush, from 490 BCE on the wall front of a mountain. So this is basically an inscription that he had carved into the rock when he came to power and after some of his campaigns, and it's to this day it's clear to see. He writes, a great God is Ahura Mazda, who created this earth, who created yonder sky, who created man, who created happiness for man, who made Darius king of many, one lord of many. I am Darius, the great king, king of kings, king of countries, containing all kinds of men, king in this great earth, far and wide, son of high Tapses, an Achaemenid, a Persian, son of a Persian, an Aryan, having Aryan lineage. King Darius says, by the favor of Ahura Mazda, these are the countries which I seized outside of Persia. I ruled over them. They bore tribute to me. They did what was said to them by me, and they held my law firmly. Media, Elam, Partha, Arya, Bactria, Sogdia, Khwarezmia, Dragnonia, Arcosia, Satygidia, Gandhara, India, the Homo drinking Scythians, the Scythians with pointed caps, Babylonia, Assyria, Arabia. He's mentioned Arabia here. Egypt, Armenia, Cappadocia, Lydia, the Greeks, Iona, the Scythians across the sea, Saka, Thrace, which is parts of Greece, the Petassos-wearing Greeks, Iona, the Libyans, the Nubians, the men of Makkah, and Koreans. So you can see that a large part of the known world he held sway over, all of these people. And he mentions the Arabians here. Then he carries on. King Darius says, Aro Mazda, when he saw this earth in commotion, thereafter bestowed it upon me, made me king. I am king. By the favor of Aro Mazda, I put it down in its place. What I said to them, that they did as was my desire. If now you shall think that how many are the countries which King Darius held, look at the sculptures of those who bear the throne. Then shall you know, then shall it be known to you, the spear of a Persian man has gone forth far. Then shall it become known to you, a Persian man has delivered battle far indeed from Persia. Darius the king says, this which has been done, all that by the will of Aro Mazda I did. Aro Mazda bore me aid until I did the work. May Aro Mazda protect me from harm and my royal house and this land. This I pray of Aro Mazda. This may Aro Mazda give to me. O man, that which is the command of Aro Mazda, let this not seem repugnant to you. Do not leave the right path. Do not rise in rebellion. So this is his inscription. And here is the mountain he's carved it under. And you can see that there are three huge tombs actually. They are actually tombs. And he's carved it in there. Naqsh Rustam. This is a stunning piece of work dating back 2,000 years. More than 2,000 years. Now the Behistan inscription in the Bagastana, this is another inscription. Bagastana means place where the gods dwell, right? So King Darius says, these are the countries which are subject unto me, and by the grace of Aro Mazda I became king of them. Persia, Parsa, Elam, Ovia, Babylonia, Biboros, Assyria, Athora, Arabia, Arabia. So he's mentioned it again. Egypt, Moderaya, the countries by the sea, Lydia, Sparta, Iona, Media, Mada, Armen in Armenia, Cappadocia, Katpatukha, and Parthia, Parthava, Drangina, Zaraka, Arya, Harabia, Khorezma, Ovarizmia, Bactria, Sogdia, Soguda, Gandhara, Scythia, Saka, Satyagadia, Satyagos, Arcosia, Haravotis, and Makkah, 23 lands in all. Now this is the Behistan inscription. You can see here now that these are all the different people from different nations being represented here. So if you look at them carefully, you can pick out exactly which nation is which. He's standing on the left, the tall big guy, and you can see they've all come to pay him homage, or even as prisoners. Unfortunately, even this site was harmed during the Russian and British collusion. They invaded Iran during World War to secure it and to make sure that Germany never got in, and that they could keep the oil flowing from Central Asia down into the Persian Gulf. And it was because of the Russians that this site also got damaged a little bit. The Apadana East Stairs. Now, the Great Stairs of the Apadana at Persepolis was the capital. Pasargad in the Persian language was the capital of the Hakamenish Empire, and it was destroyed as a wanton act of vandalism by Alexander the Great. And one of the reasons he did that is because of its splendor. Right? There was nothing in the West to rival that, and there was no reason for him to do that, but he did it. But the Apadana still stands, the grand stairways and the pillars still stand. So when you look at the area, you can really get to see it's like Capitol Hill, the USA is today. And it's a huge complex, and from all over the empire, tribute would come and people would come to pay homage. And it has these stairways that still exist, and on those stairways you can see people walking up with the tribute that they bring. And you can see the Arab there, right? His face features, the hair, the clothing, it's all shown there. So the east stairway of the Apadana Persepolis shows a procession of people bringing tribute to the Achaemenid king. The reliefs were made in the last years of the 6th century and the first years of the 5th, and they were probably executed by Greek artists. And the Arabs who wore no caps were never completely subdued by the Persians, but those living there. So the Apadana still stands, the stairway still stands, and on either side you can see people coming with their tribute. So they're bringing goods to the king, and the king is standing at the top receiving the gifts, and each of the figures is dressed differently. The hairstyles are different, the facial features are different, and what they're bringing is different. So that shows you the different nationalities and the ethnicities that were coming to pay homage to the greatest king that the world had seen up to that time. And the Arabs were there as well. So also the Persians never completely subdued the Arabs. Nobody ever subdued the Arabs. Why? Because the Arabs weren't one nation. They were desperate tribes. Sometimes they banded together for their own interests and they moved away again. And second thing is that they would just move back into the desert, and there was nothing in the desert for anybody to invest any money to take. Whatever they needed, the coastal areas, the trade and everything else, and the main cities, like we mentioned, Nebuchadnezzar took Tamar. So they took what they needed, like the Romans took Petra, Hegra, they were down, they had contingents, military contingents there. The Syrians took what they needed, the Persians as well, only as far as what was economically viable to them. So that's the reason why nobody really conquered the Arabs, and they were left really to their own devices to slowly develop their own identity. So here you can see here, and the particular individual carrying camel behind him, that's an Arab there. And you can see from his dress and everything, that's an Arab. And here is a picture of an Arab. So he's wearing no headdress this time. And from here you can see the features, the hawk-like nose, the almond big dark eyes, the chiseled features, and the hair, which is wavy and long. And these are typical Arabian features. Here is the Apadana. It's the large hypostyle hall. And it was used by Cyrus and used by Darius, and this is what stands of it today. And you can see the people walking up the stairs there. It was a huge site. Okay, so now we've traced the earliest record of Arabs, the mention of Arabs in Persian inscriptions, in the Assyrians, what they had to say. The Romans have their own, but because the Romans carry on till quite late, we'll use them as we talk about the Arabs further. Now, let's see what we know about the Arabs.